Díomh gach daoine agus fáilte go dtí a cad of brethbh a nocht. Hello everybody, welcome to the Brehon Academy tonight as we continue our journey into a story of an Irish Sept by Nottige Charles Macnamara. Tonight we're going to be reading chapter 4, which goes into the spiritual beliefs of the early Irish. Did the Irish believe in reincarnation? Were the Druids like some sort of Buddhist monks? How is St. Patrick's mission in Ireland so successful? These are just a couple of the topics that we're going to cover in chapter 4. Before I jump into it, just to remind you, you can download this book from the brehonacademy.org members library. It's completely free to become a member. You have access to currently over 100 resources. I think there's 120 there at the moment. Just search for Story of an Irish Sept. You'll be able to download the PDF and read along with this video, or obviously save it for reading in the future. The reading of this chapter lasts about 45 minutes, and I'd like to have a little bit of discussion with you guys at the end, just to go a bit deeper into some of the topics that Macnamara raises here, because to be fair, there's quite a lot in this, and if you're like me, you're going to end up having more questions at the end of this than you have going into it. We're going to talk, as I said, about Irish spirituality and what does that mean. The pre-Christian Irish spirituality, which we might call pagan just for short, and the Christian Ireland, Christian spirituality, the early Christian church, and later how that evolved into the church that we have today. So one of the things Macnamara does here is he connects the Irish teachings and manuscripts to the Vedas of India. So we're finding evidence for this belief of what did the Druids actually believe, what did they teach, from the writings of ancient India, which is fascinating in itself. We're going to ask, what did the Druids actually believe? How did they worship? Or their spiritual understanding of reality? And how St. Patrick came to Ireland and then challenged the order of the Druids and was successful by lighting his fire on the sacred hill. The fire that would burn for many generations to come. At the end of this chapter, we're going to be introduced to three interesting characters from Irish history. The first two are introduced together. Their story is intertwined. It's Celestius and Pelagius. Pelagius was a philosopher who was writing kind of like logical arguments in the realm of theology. He challenged the accepted notion at the time of original sin, and Celestius was one of his most important followers, and we'll learn about these two guys. Another very interesting character, the last person we'll talk about today, is John Scottos, Regina. He is another person. He was a layman. He wasn't a priest or in the clergy, but he and his ideas shook the established order of the time. His ideas about truth, religion, life, and he wrote about these, and we're going to learn a little bit about John Scotus Eredina's writing. And in case you don't know, this guy is John Scotus Eredina, who appears on the old Irish £5 banknotes. So with that being said, let's get into the chapter.
The Story of an Irish Sept, Chapter 4. Religious opinions of the early Irish, the Irish Druid and his belief in a supreme being, Transmigration, Christianity among early Irish, St. Patrick, the Celtic Irish Church, how Druidism long continued after Patrick's time, St. Patrick engrafted Christianity into paganism, St. Columba, strife between monasteries, Celestius, AD 370, and his opinions, John Scotus, Eredina, and Appendix. Having briefly referred to some of the laws and social institutions of our ancestors, we may now consider the ideas upon which their religious convictions were based. With them, Christianity was engrafted upon a long-established belief in a supreme being, the quickening spirit of the universe. Belief of the early Irish in the world of spirits. The ideas held by the Irish Celt on this subject were in all probability derived from their remote ancestors and have been handed down to us in the Sanskrit Vedas. From these writings we learn that the early Aryans believed in God, the eternal origin of all things, and in the immortality of the soul. Their idea was that the spirit or soul of a being emanated from God and passed at the time of birth into man. God was the soul and the life. The soul, becoming contaminated by evil during its residence in a human being, was incapacitated from reuniting with God until purified by passing through other forms of living creatures. Everything that moved had life, or, in other words, was endowed with the divine nature. In this way, our forefathers came to believe that the heavenly bodies, clouds, winds, the sea and rivers, including the vegetable and animal kingdom, were alive through the presence in them of the Spirit of God, which spirit influenced their actions. Holding views of this kind, we can readily understand the power which individuals would gain over their fellow creatures, if they could persuade them that they were able to influence the spirit which dwelt in the sun, sea, rivers, and so on. The priests of old assumed this prerogative, asserting their power over nature through familiarity with the spirit governing the universe. They studied medicine and the properties of plants, the seasons, and the heavenly bodies, and so came to learn something of the movements of the moon and planets, and grew to be astronomers, wise men, and teachers of their fellow creatures. The Druids seem to have held the same position among the Irish and continental Celts as the Aryan guru held in the East. Mommsen, in his History of Rome, observes that the Druids, in whom the Celts had implicit faith, kept up the national feeling among the people, who believed that the Druids were able to influence the spirits presiding over the elements. They were magicians or wise men who could propitiate both the good and also the malignant spirits. Druids in this way came to wield a vast influence over the affairs of their countrymen, in that they were held capable of bringing the elements and everything that moved to minister to the wants of man. Julius Caesar informs us that in his day the Celtic Druids of Gaul believed in the immortality of the soul and in transmigration. He considered that this was the key to their system. Caesar states that the Druids were a privileged class, equal in rank to the chiefs. They were judges in all matters of dispute. He adds that the Druids presided over schools of learning, to which youths flocked eagerly for instruction, that they taught everything by verse which was never committed to writing, in order to strengthen the memories of their pupils and to preserve their knowledge from becoming popularized. Caesar further states that the Druids were fond of discussing the movements of the stars, of the earth, and of the universe. If we turn to the accounts which we possess of the Irish Druids, we find that they were consulted and their advice was implicitly followed in almost every step of life, whether relating to private or public affairs. Kings, chiefs, and the heads of families consulted their Druids on all important questions. They acted also as arbitrators in cases of disputes. The head Druid of Ireland was hardly inferior to the monarch in dignity. They did not attempt to control the morals of the people. Not that the early Irish Druids were immoral, but as Dr. Taylor observes, they were unmoral. Matters of this kind were beyond their province. The authority of the Irish Druid rested absolutely on the belief that he possessed a knowledge of the world of spirit which was not granted to ordinary mortals, and further, that this knowledge was only to be acquired by long-continued contemplation and study. It would seem, however, that anyone who wished might become a Druid if he chose to fit himself for this calling. Irish Druids were exempt from paying tribute and from military service. They taught their pupils in verse and not only instructed them in religion, but also in astronomy and the laws of the country, and even in military accomplishments. For instance, we find that the chief Druid of the province of Ulster, about the commencement of the Christian era, presided over a school of this kind. He limited the number of his pupils to 100. The Brehon law tracts contain an introduction which there is a good reason to suppose is one of the most ancient records we possess in the Celtic language. It appears to be older than the body of work, and in it is an account of the creation of the world, resembling that given in the Vedas. From the footnote, space being divided into the dark portion of the heavens and the starry systems. The dark portion, spirit, primary substance. The light portion, the same substance made tangible to the senses under the form of matter. That's from Buddhism and Christianity by A. Lilly. Returning to the text, Colonel Wood Martin, in his work on pagan Ireland, remarks that from St. Patrick's hymn we learn that the pagan Irish worshipped and invoked the personified powers of nature, and that this is corroborated by passages from ancient manuscripts. For instance, received as pledges that the sovereignty should forever rest in his family, quote, the sun and moon, the sea, the dew and colours, and all the elements visible and invisible, and every element which is in heaven and on earth, end quote. Another monarch, having broken his oath, perished from sun and from wind, and, quote, from the rest of the pledges, for transgressing them in that time used not to be dared, end quote. Again, in one of the poems of the heroic age, Cuchulainn called on the waters, on heaven, earth, and the rivers to protect him, and the elements answered his appeal. St. Patrick expunged much of the Brehon code which referred to druidical customs. Nevertheless, in the preface to these laws, and in various passages found in the Seancas Mór, we have references to some of the practices of the Druids. For instance, we read that the Druid was in the habit of, quote, placing his rod upon a person, and through means of the wand he could discover his history. In the same way, he could, in a moment, give an accurate answer to any questions put to him. He could reveal the time of a person's death, or of his own decease. End quote. In another of these law tracts, there is a reference made to sacrifices offered to evil spirits, demon feasts as they are called, or provision for the sons of death and the spirits of evil men. Sacrifices made to such spirits were of a different kind to that offered to good spirits. In the very ancient book of Invasions, we have the words supposed to have been used by the chief druid who accompanied a large body of Celtic invaders to Ireland. A great storm having arisen, the druid invoked the spirits ruling the elements and so quieted the waves, after which he is said to have used the following language. I pray that they reach the land of Erin, those who are riding upon the great sea, that they be distributed upon her plains, her mountains, and her valleys, upon her forests that shed showers of nuts and all other fruit, upon her rivers, lakes, and great waters. End quote. As Professor O'Curry remarks, there is nothing in the character of this very ancient record to distinguish it from the prayer of any Christian of the present day, so far as the expression of the speaker's wants and desires are concerned. The old Irish legends are full of wonders performed by Druids, but in all this literature we hear nothing of human sacrifices. They raised mists and storms to confound the enemies of the ruler of their country and for other purposes. But one fails to obtain evidence of cruelty on their part. There is none whatever for imputing to them human sacrifices in the ceremonies they performed to propitiate the spirits ordering the course of nature and the destinies of the human race. With reference to the idea of transmigration, it seems probable that it may have arisen in the minds of the ancient Aryans from their experience of the hereditary transmission of the disposition of parents to their posterity. The sins of the fathers had to pass through several generations before their effects were expunged from their descendants. However this may have been, transmigration was a belief accepted by the Aryan races and by the Celts of Ireland. In the ancient book of Ballymote, which was a compilation of still older Celtic poems, the following verses refer to this belief in plain language. The poem alludes to the birth of a famous Irish hero, Carol, who we are told for 100 years complete he lived. He lived in blooming manhood. 300 years in the shape of a wild ox, he lived on extensive plains. 205 years he lived in the shape of a wild boar. 300 years he was still in the flesh in shape of an old bird. 100 delightful years he lived in the shape of a salmon in the flood. Mongan, king of Ulster, as late as the 7th century, declares that he was not what men took him to be, the son of the mortal Fianna, but of Manannán mac Lir and the reincarnation of the great Finn. And he called back from the grave the famous Fenian Cuilta to prove this. The same way the hero Tuathail Carol had also a second birth, and the warrior Cuchulainn had his parentage ascribed to the god Louis, and not to his reputed father. At the close of the 10th century, the doctrine of transmigration would seem to have still lingered in the imagination of Irishmen. From the footnote, Malhussán O'Carroll, the well-known author of the Annals of Inishfallen and friend of Brian Boru, had 3 favourite pupils who were so much alike that it was difficult to distinguish them from one another. They desired to perform a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. O'Carroll granted them their request, but foretold the death of the 3 friends in the east, and his request was that after their decease they should return to him and tell him how long he had left to live and what were his prospects of heaven. The 3 students reached Jerusalem and died there. After that, they met the Archangel Michael and asked him to let them know the fate of O'Carroll. They were informed that to perdition he must pass because he falsified the canon, for his lecherous habits, and because he had abandoned the Althus. The 3 students passed into the bodies of 3 white doves, and in this shape appeared to O'Carroll. They told him what they had heard. O'Carroll excused himself on the ground that his son being sick unto death, he sung the Althus round him 7 times a day, but it was of no avail, and so he had given up the Althus, as it was evident God did not care for it. After a time, the disciples again returned to their master, and were able to afford him more consolation than at the first visit. And so the story runs on, and like many others of the same class point to the idea of transmigration. Returning to the text, it is impossible to ascertain with any precision what the ideas entertained by the common people were upon these matters. We get here and there glimpses of the inner life of the more important actors in the drama, but of the lesser lights we know next to nothing. As an example of my meaning, we may refer to the expressions used by the King Cormac Mac Art, one of Ireland's greatest heroes, who flourished from AD 227 to 266. He was not only a distinguished warrior, but a man of considerable literary attainments. The historian Keating has given us an account of Cormac's career, which need not be referred to in this place, beyond mentioning a characteristic anecdote of the young king. Cormac Mac Art, when a boy, was one day present in his uncle's court at Tara. It appears that certain sheep had strayed into and eaten up some of vegetables growing in the Queen's garden. The case was brought before the king, and he adjudged the sheep to the plaintiff in lieu of the trespass. Young Cormac, hearing the sentence, came forward and remarked, "The judgment were more equitable were the shearing of the sheep given in damage of the green stuff cropped. For in the ground the grass will grow again, and so will the wool upon the sheep." Cormac, having been actively engaged throughout a long reign, determined, in consequence of an injury he had received to one of his eyes, to resign his throne in favour of his son, and to devote the remaining years of his life, as he stated, quote, "to meditation and the worship of God, the Creator of heaven, and also of a place in which the souls of the wicked should be justly punished." End quote. These were Cormac's own words, recorded by himself in a work which existed in Keating's time, and from which the historian quotes. These expressions were made use of by Cormac before Christianity had spread into Ireland. He was brought up by a Druid and practised their art, for he undertook to cure one of his friends of leprosy by means of magic. It seems therefore probable that expressions such as those above quoted were not far removed from what was taught by the Druids before Christianity was introduced into Ireland. For in those days, Druids were the chief, if not the only schoolmasters in Ireland. Cormac distinctly stated, quote, that it was beneath the dignity of a rational being to adore anything in the form of an idol, but that his prayers should be directed to the living supreme being who created all things. End quote. The following are some of his expressions which have come down to us through another Cormac of Cashel. "Wilt thou steer my gloomy little bark upon the broad-bosomed foaming ocean? Wilt thou come, O bright King of heaven, while my own will inclines to go to sea? With thee the great, with thee the small, with thee the fall of hosts is but a shower. O God, wilt thou assist me while coming over the boisterous sea?" There is much of the ring of the Vedic language in these lines. In fact, The mind of the early Celtic inhabitants of Ireland was essentially Eastern. They inherited no inconsiderable amount of the opinions, laws, and traditions of the old Aryan stock from which they sprung. General Valency gave many years' work to subjects of this kind. He came to the conclusion that, quote, the established religion of the early Irish was a form of Buddhism, end quote. Much of the folklore of the Hindus at the present day is clearly identical with that of the Irish Celt. For instance, in the Irish romance of the children of Lear, who were metamorphosed into swans, which, with the changing seasons, come and go on Lough Erne. These birds come and go, scatheless, for in the mind of the Celtic peasantry they represent the souls of holy women who fell victims to Norsemen, an example of a pagan legend being completely Christianized. Numerous old legends have in the same way been modified so as to fall in with the notions of Christian writers, and many of the old pagan institutions survived far into Christian times, such as the Fair of Carman. In an appendix to this chapter, I have quoted from Mr. Standish Hayes O'Grady's Silver Gadelica a charge given by one of the ancient Irish Celts to his grandchild, advice older than our era, but containing much which many of us might take to heart and follow with advantage. Christianity among the early Irish. Although Palladius preceded St. Patrick as Bishop of Ireland, it was not until the arrival of the latter saint in the country, about the year AD 432, that Christianity took root among the inhabitants of Erin. Patrick, as a youth, having been carried a prisoner into Ireland, was employed by his master to look after sheep. He remained at work of this kind for 6 years, during which time he must have learnt the Celtic language and much concerning the tribal and family system which then prevailed throughout the country. He subsequently escaped from captivity and after some years returned to Ireland as bishop. From St. Patrick's hymn we learn that after, quote, binding himself to many Christian virtues, which may be taken as confessions of his belief in certain Christian doctrines, he goes on binding himself to the elements, claiming thus that not alone were the powers of Christianity on his side, but also the very elements that were worshipped by his opponents, end quote. It is most interesting to follow the method adopted by this remarkable man in his efforts to convert the natives of Ireland to Christianity. Patrick was born a leader of men and appreciated the importance in a society such as he had to deal with on working from the fountainhead downwards. No sooner had he arrived in the country than he went to Tara to demonstrate to the monarch that whatever powers Irish Druids might have over nature, he possessed a greater power than theirs. Having demonstrated this fact to the satisfaction of the king, he became a Christian, as also did his head poet or bard. After accomplishing this task, the conversion of the nation came as a matter of course. The kings of Munster and Connacht soon followed the example set them by the monarch. St. Patrick was indefatigable in moving from one part of Ireland to another, baptizing chiefs and their retainers, who seemed to have accepted the new faith. St. Patrick's hymn. I bind myself today to the virtues of heaven, light of sun, brightness of moon, splendour of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of sea, stability of earth, compactness of rock. Patrick having been called before the king together with the chief druid, they were directed to work miracles, and the druid brought snow on the plain in front of them by chance of wizardry and the arts of devilry. Said Patrick, "Put away the snow that has fallen." The druid declined to do so till tomorrow. Patrick said, "It is in evil thy power stands, not in good." He then blessed the plain throughout the four quarters, and quicker than speech the snow vanished. The druid invoked darkness, which Patrick removed by prayer to the Lord. So, with water, fire, and so on, the druid appealing to the spirit influencing the elements and all moving matter, Patrick, by appeal to God, obtaining aid directly from the supreme ruler of the universe. We are told that Patrick said to the king, "Unless thou believest now thou shalt die." Then the king went into the assembly house of the people, For me, he said, belief in God is better than what is threatened to me that I be killed. So then the king knelt to Patrick and believed in God, but he did not believe with a pure heart. And on that day, many thousands believed, without question. But they did not, as a rule, discard their druidical ideas. In fact, we know that as late as the year AD 648, Marion, the wife of the king of Connacht, a most compassionate and well-disposed lady, held to the ancient faith, and had recourse to an eminent druid, a retainer of the family, to reveal to her certain domestic matters. With regard to the mass of the people, they may have absorbed a definite amount of Christianity, but it would be difficult to fix the point where their religion ceased to be druidical and became Christian. St. Patrick never even suggested persecution as a means of enforcing the acceptance of Christianity by the people. We have an example of his method of conversion in the case of the daughters of the king of Connacht. He met these ladies accompanied by their tutors, who were Druids. The king's daughters proceeded at once to question Patrick as followed. They inquired, whence he came, whither he was going, are ye men of the hills, or are ye gods? To which Patrick answered, it would be better for you to believe in God than to ask what race we are. The eldest daughter asked, who is your God and where is he? Is he in heaven, or is he in earth, or under the earth, or upon the earth, or in the seas, or in the streams, or mountains, or valleys? Has he sons and daughters? Has he gold and silver? Is there abundance of all sorts of wealth in his kingdom? To these questions the saint made appropriate answers. The king's daughters and their tutors were then baptized. St. Patrick visited South Munster and was received by Angus, king of that province, at Cashel. This king was the great-grandson of Cormac Mac Art, the progenitor of the O'Briens, Macnamaras, and other Dalcassian families. There is a curious story referred to by the Abbé McGagan in his history regarding the baptism of Angus. The holy bishop, having leaned on his pastoral staff which was pointed with iron, it pierced the king's foot, who suffered the pain without complaining till the ceremony was ended. The apostle, hearing of the accident, asked his disciple why he had not complained. The king answered that he supposed the wound inflicted on his foot formed part of the ceremony. From Cashel, Patrick proceeded across the Shannon to Cratloe, where it is quite possible one of the Sept of Macnamaras resided, for it was there that we find them from the earliest records in our possession. However this may be, the saint is said to have journeyed through Clare to the mountains which separate that county from Galway. McGagan states that the inhabitants of Thomond, many of whom at this time were of the old race, received Patrick. The Celts, in fact, had only conquered the firbolgs of this locality some 40 years previous to the visit which St. Patrick paid this part of the country. In the life of St. Patrick, as given by Dr. Todd and other authorities, we learn that his success was so great that he soon found it necessary to make arrangements to meet the spiritual needs of the infant Celtic Church. This he did by ordaining natives of the country, who, being ignorant of Latin, employed the Celtic language in the offices of the Church. Dr. O'Donovan states that nothing is clearer than that Patrick engrafted Christianity on the pagan superstitions with so much skill that he won the people over to the Christian religion before they understood the exact difference between the two systems of belief, and much of this half-pagan, half-Christian religion will be found not only in the Irish stories of the Middle Ages, but in the superstitions of the peasantry of the present day. St. Patrick further adopted the customs and laws of the country in founding monasteries and other religious houses for the use of his followers. After having baptized the chief, he obtained a grant of land from him, upon which a church and surrounding houses were built, the whole being enclosed in a wall and fence forming the sanctuary. Here, ecclesiastical and lay members of the monastery lived. At first, they were all of the same tribe as the chief on whose lands they had established themselves, but in time they collected landholders and also bondsmen on their estate, who were in no way related to the members of the tribe. They were, however, bound to do military service under the head of the monastery. In fact, the monastical establishment was made a part of the tribal system of the country, its head and his tanis being elected to office by the community and having all the rights and lands which belonged to the original head of the monastery. He was not unfrequently a temporal and spiritual superior, the latter being elected by the monks, the former by the members of the Sept or clan to which the establishment belonged. The bishop had no judicial or administrative power over such establishments. His function was spiritual. The church, thus established by St. Patrick, consisted of isolated communities engrafted onto the tribe of the locality in which they were founded. The original home threw out branches, and so a monastery, like the conjoint family, spread. To all connected with such an establishment, family words were applied, signifying kinship and tribe. We may refer to the life of St. Columba as illustrating the working of this system. He was born AD 521 and belonged to the tribe of O'Donnell. Columba was educated in the famous school of Clonard, and being destined for the church was sent to Clonford to be ordained a domestic bishop. On arriving in that place, Columba found the bishop engaged in ploughing his land. Having been ordained, the saint devoted himself to missionary work among his countrymen. Columba was a distinguished scribe, and having borrowed a portion of the scriptures from his friend, the abbot of Clonard, he proceeded to copy the work. The owner of the book subsequently demanded not only its return, but also the copy Columba had made, but the saint refused to give up his copy of the work, and the friends, not being able to settle the matter in dispute, referred it to the King of Meath. The king decided that Columba must give up his copy as well as the original book to the abbot, upon the principles contained in the Brehon law that, quote, "To every cow belongs her little offspring, so to every book belongs its copy," end quote. Columba gave up his manuscript, but he was, quote, "rash, passionate, and revengeful," end quote. And being a chief in his tribe, as well as an ecclesiastic, in the year AD 561, he ordered out a large body of his tribesmen to attack the men of Meath. A battle ensued, in which some 3,000 men are said to have been killed. We need not follow the subsequent life of St. Columba in his home in Iona, or the wonderful work he performed in Scotland in converting the king and inhabitants of that country to Christianity. It was not until the year AD 804 that the Irish monastic communities were exempted from military service. During the year 673, there was persistent war between the monasteries of Clonmacnoise and Durrow, and as late as AD 816, in a scrimmage between these establishments, some 400 men are reported to have been slain. The clergy in the 8th century went about the country and to synods armed, often fought pitched battles in which many were killed with but very small provocation. Although this state of things existed in Ireland, her monasteries were at the same time sending out missionaries whose devotion to their work in England and many parts of the continent of Europe has never been surpassed. The first rector of the school of Paris was a pupil of Bede, and the second rector of that great school was an Irishman named Clement. As in the case of St. Columba, the better qualities of the Celtic missionaries were most conspicuously developed when serving in foreign countries. At home, their warlike proclivities often predominated over the principles they professed. But we must not overlook the fact that it was due to the efforts of the early Irish Church that women were emancipated in that country from military service, and that slavery in its grosser form, that is, in the traffic in human beings, was abolished. Before bringing this chapter to a close, we may refer to two famous Irishmen who, in no small degree, disturbed the minds of the Orthodox in the 5th and 8th centuries. Celestius, an Irishman, was born about the year AD 370, and therefore some 60 years before St. Patrick's time. He travelled to Rome to study law, and there fell in with a fellow countryman, the theologian Pelagius. Celestius struck up a warm friendship with Pelagius, and not only espoused his opinions, but, according to Archbishop Usher, he became, quote, "the greatest depressor of God's grace and the advance of man's reason. He held that every one was governed by his own will, and received so much grace as he did merit," end quote. In fact, Celestius, who was educated by Druids and Brehons in Ireland, adopted sufficient Christianity to efface the grosser ideas contained in the system in which he had been brought up, and at the same time could not accept much of the supernatural in Christianity. Dr. Stokes observes that Celestius was one of the most prominent figures in the religious and political world of his day. His activity was immense. He had developed, even in that early time, a true Irish faculty for agitation, and realised fully that successful agitation can only be carried on by intense personal exertion. We find him disputing in Carthage, Rome, Constantinople, and in the Far East. He bearded the patriarchs in one place and the Pope in Rome. He was excommunicated by a council at Ephesus. But what mattered that to Celestius? If the Pope and patriarchs agreed with him, so much the better, but if not, he did not care, but would seek redress in other quarters. There is reason to suppose that with Pelagius he ended his days in his native country. From the footnotes, Pelagius held 1. That Adam had mortality in his nature, and whether he had sinned or not must have died. 2. That Adam's sin was confined to himself. 3. That newly born infants are in the same condition as Adam was before the fall. 4. That man may by his own exertions remain free from sin, the liberty of the will, law of nature, being sufficient for that purpose and to overcome temptation. 5. That as the death and disobedience of Adam is not the necessary cause of death to all mankind, neither does the resurrection of the dead follow from the resurrection of the Saviour. Celestius, however, passed from this line of reasoning into those of pantheism, preceding in this respect his still more distinguished fellow countryman, Johannes Eredina. John Scotus Eredina, of much the same cast of mind as Celestius, flourished in the 9th century. He was an eminent scholar, and was sent for from Ireland by Charles the Bald to translate certain Greek works. Dr. Stokes describes Eredina as a thorough Irishman. He was brilliant, learned, and a heretic. So much so that the Pope Honorius III issued a bull declaring that the works of John the Irishman, quote, abounded with worms of heretical depravity, end quote. Excommunication was denounced against him and all who should retain in their possession a copy of his works. He advocated the pantheistic philosophy which many modern authors ascribe to Spinoza. Through the teachings of Johannes, the Irish school of the 9th century came to exercise a direct influence over the philosophical thought of modern times. Eredina's principal work, the Division Naturae, is written in the form of a dialogue, distinguished for its Aristotelian acuteness and extensive information. In this work he argues that, as before creation God alone existed, and in him were the potential causes of all future existence, so too, in the end, all created existence would return to God, for they were a portion of the universal life or divine nature. The idea upon which Vedantism rests, and which Eredina either produced from the depth of his own consciousness, or it was a resuscitation of the religious belief of his forefathers. A belief which Vedantists hold is summed up in a few words. Quote, God, the Word, is true. The world is false. Man's soul is God and nothing else. There is nothing worth gaining. There is nothing worth enjoying. There is nothing worth knowing but God alone, for he who knows God is God. End quote. It is beyond my power to attempt to follow John Scotus Eredina or to explain his views. Some of his opinions will be found in an appendix to this chapter. It seems that the prominent feature in the religious belief of the Druids as given by Cormac Mac Art, as also that of Celestius and of Johannes Scotus Eredina, was centred in the worship of God, the creator of the universe and giver of life. God was life, and all things living therefore were for the time being the abode of God. At the time of death, the life returned to God, as being a part of the divine nature. In this belief, there was no need of human intervention between God and man. Cormac Mac Art desired to be alone with his God, and by retiring from the world and all its cares to cultivate the spirit which dwelt in him and was destined to exist to all eternity. Celestius harps on the same idea, and J.S. Eredina dilates on the subject and endeavours to clear away the clouds of superstition which in his opinion obscured Christianity. His work, the Division Naturae, we have evidence that as far back as AD 850, Irish men were well instructed in concerted music, for he dilates on the harmony produced by the combination of a number of voices taking different parts. These parts, he observes, alone are anything but melodious, but under the hand of the composer they are brought into unison. And so, he argues, it is with the apparently discordant elements by which we are surrounded. Each organism is a part related to the whole universe, which is moving on to perfection in God. Mr. Standish H. O'Grady, in his Silver Gedelica, has given us a translation from an old Celtic manuscript contained in the Book of Lismore, the Colloquy of the Ancients. This is stated to have been taken from a still more ancient work which is now lost, the Book of Monaster Boyce. In this colloquy we have a conversation reported which was supposed to have taken place between St. Patrick and the last of the Alfenia of Ireland. It is interesting as giving us some idea of the wisdom and philosophy of the early Irish Celts. Cuilche, the Fenian, states that Finn, the chief, had given the following rules of conduct to his grandson, rules which, according to the narrative, must have been drawn up before the commencement of the Christian era. Macluach, if armed service be thy design, in a great man's house be quiet, be surly in the rugged past. Without a fault of his beat not thy hound, until thou ascertain her guilt, bring not a charge against thy wife. In battle, meddle not with a buffoon, for, O Macluach, he is but a fool. Censure not any if he be of grave repute. Stand not up to take part in a brawl. Neither have anything at all to do with either a mad or a wicked one. 2/3 of thy gentleness to be shown to women and to creepers on the floor, that is, little children. Likewise to men of art that make the doings, and be not violent to the common people. With thy familiars, with them that are of thy counsel, hasten not to be the first into bed. Perverse alliance shun, and all that is prohibited. Yield not thy reverence to all. Utter not swaggerish speech, nor say that thou wilt not render the thing that is right, for a shameful thing it is to speak too swiftly, unless that it be feasible to carry out thy word. So long as in the universe thou shalt exist, thy chief forsake not. Neither for gold nor for other valuable in the earthly world abandon thou thy guarantee, that is, him that places himself under thy protection. To a chief utter not strenuous criticism of his people, for it is not a good man's occupation to abuse a great lord's people to their chief. Be not a continually tattling talebearer, nor a false one. Be not loquacious nor censorious rashly. Be the multiplicity of thy chivalrous qualities what it may, yet have thou not the Iract's hostility inclined to thee. Be not a frequenter of the drinking house, nor given to carping at old men. The conduct thou hearest recommended, that is right. Meddle not with a man of mean estate. Deal not in refusing of thy meat, and any that is penurious have not for a familiar. Force not thyself upon a chief, nor give a chief lord occasion to speak ill of thee. Stick to thy raiment, hold fast to thine armature, until the stern fight with its weapon glitter be well ended. Never renounce to back thy luck, yet follow after gentleness, Macluach. Succession and benediction, said Patrick. A good story it is that thou hast told us here. And where is Brehon the scribe? Brehon answered, Here, holy cleric, be that tale written by thee. And Brehon performed it on the spot. John Scotus, Eredina. Erdman, in his work on the history of philosophy, Volume 1, page 291, observes that Eredina was the Charlemagne of scholastic philosophy. He was born about 815 and was still living in 877. He was a layman. His chief work is based on the idea propounded by himself that true religion is also the true philosophy, and vice versa. The idea that every doubt can be refuted by philosophy was so preposterous an idea that it was by the clergy declared to be insensate blasphemy. Regina held that the fathers taught what they learned by reason. By reason is meant the common thought which reveals itself in conversation, where out of two reasons are made one, each speaker as it were becoming the other. The organ of this general thinking is the intellectus, also called animus, which stands above the ratio, which has below it the five senses and the life force which belongs to the soul, because the latter is bound to the body. His speculative knowledge is unity of subject and object. This whole investigation, physiologia, the totality of all being, natura, which is divided into four classes: the uncreated creating, the created creating, the created uncreating, the neither created nor creating. Of these, the first, the ground of all being, and the fourth, the last goal, fall in God. The second and third embrace the creation. Of his 5 books, each describes a class. In the 5th book, the return of every created thing into the source of creation is exhibited. The first 4 are Eredina's theology and physics, the last his ethics. The scriptures are allegorically interpreted. He summons Origen, Ambrose, Augustine, and many of the fathers to his aid. First book. God is the uncreated creator, summa bonitas, and so the unity of 3 persons, essentia, virtus, operatio. God is all in all, no being outside of him. All exists so far as God appears in it. God, without ceasing to be above things, in them comes into being and creates himself. The second book, first transition. The created creating nature, the cause primordialis, although created eternal, because God must always have created, or creation would have been accidental with him, which is impossible. The chaos of Moses is referred to the primitive cause, by whom the brooding spirit is divided into genera and species. This is the only seed from which all proceed. Whatever is real in things is a participation in the creating truth. Third book, Physics. He looks on creation and preservation as one. God did all he had to do at once. The becoming cognizable in the highest existence of things. Things are in man when he sees them. The fourth book. The goal is the return of man to God, also in the 5th book. Evil is the perverted tendency of the will, which is good. There is a restoration of all things at the final goal, even the demons. In death, the elements are separated. All passes over into the causae primordialis, and the attainment of the full knowledge of God, in which the knowing and the known become one. It is not absorption, for the individuality is preserved.
And there you have it, chapter 4 of A Story of an Irish Sept. Like I said at the beginning of this video, if you're like me, you left this reading with more questions than you had going into it. I found this chapter to be quite fascinating, eye-opening, and gave me a deeper understanding of just the contribution of Irish thinkers to the evolution of philosophy and theological thought in the era in which they lived, and it was phenomenal. The Pelagian heresy, as it has come down to us today, and the writings of Scotus, a man who was so significant and known and influential that he made his way onto the £5 Irish banknotes. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to go a bit deeper into some of the topics that were talked about here, to flesh them out. And why I think it's important is trying to understand the Irish spirituality, the Irish psyche, is quite challenging, because much of the materials that we have, first of all, were written by monks, Christian monks. So they're clearly, or arguably, going to be writing with their Christian bias, motifs, and even a way of describing, let's say, the Tuatha De Danann. Now they're described as demons. in the Christian text. So it would have been very challenging for any monk at that time to not localize and Christianize the myth that they were talking about. So that's one factor. The other factor is we don't have what we could say like the Druids didn't write anything down, so we don't have any of their teachings or manuscripts or guides or handbooks or anything really. So because of it was such a like well guarded oral tradition of teaching, it eventually died out because there was and there was no records of it. So that gives another challenge to us to try and understand what is it that they believed. We have neo druids today, like people who profess to be pagan and go to sacred sites and dress up in white robes and have a staff or whatever. Like this is very like a reimagined idea based on Hollywood ideas, based on the writings of Gardner in the revival of the Wiccan movement, or the creation of it, should I say. Like there's what we think of as druidry today is we don't have a lot of material to come to those conclusions that this is what it is or this is what it should be or how it was. And this is why I think using the Vedas and the Eastern teachings about spirituality might give us an insight, a better insight into understanding those beliefs of the early Irish and early European pre-Christian people about not just the fact that they had many gods, but why, what was the philosophical foundation underpinning their belief in the gods or pantheism or reincarnation. So to talk about reincarnation briefly, first of all, the story of Finn McCool, which is mentioned briefly, it's a story of a single man or soul individual who witnessed the coming of all of these migrations of men to Ireland over the years, from Partholon to the Nemedians and to Hatadannan and Firbolgs and all this. He witnessed this from afar, and he was the one who was kind of, it was like his testimony was the one that told us about these people and their stories. So he is told as having like lived for all that time through the centuries by taking the form of different animals, shape-shifting into like a salmon and a hawk and things like that. So this would point to an idea, a primitive idea in Ireland of potentially having a belief in the transmigration of soul into different forms, into different animals and so on. Because you can go deeper into reincarnation and the philosophical understanding of it. There's different schools of approach to it. But the question then would be, did the Irish, first of all, believe in reincarnation? Did they believe that you would reincarnate up or down so you could become a human in one life and then be a mouse in the next life? We don't know. Did they believe that the consciousness of the individual is carried with them through life? Well, in the case of Finn McCool, considering he could remember his stories, that's potential that they did think that way about reincarnation. But or they could have just thought about it in a very, let's say, energetic way, or there's a word I'm looking for here, operative way. What I mean by that is they look out their at the season, they see a change, they see the cycle of death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth, life, death in the seasons themselves. So primitive man may have had an understanding about the nature of the soul and the self as being something that he observed around him in the natural forces, and not much deeper than that. We don't know. But it does at the very least give an indicator of that they did believe in a soul, and they seem to believe in an interconnectivity of all things within that soul, and which Scotus in his later books really elucidates on that idea, that there's the created that's uncreated, there's the created creation, and he steps down from this original source of God, which kind of reflects back to these ideas that I'm talking about in terms of energy and consciousness and what really happens when we die. Another interesting kind of parallel to this was the idea. This ties into St. Patrick's mission. Why was it successful? But also the Trinity and the Vedas. Because the Vedas, if we are using them as a sort of a guiding light, okay, I'm not saying it was exactly the same, but maybe we can use it as a guiding light to get more information about our heritage. But they do have a concept of the Trinity in the Vedas, except it's formulated as, you could say, creation, sustenance, and destruction. Or another way to say it is potential energy, manifested energy, and dissolved, or the dissolution of energy back into the source. And these take the name of Brahma, the creation or the potential. Vishnu is the manifest or the sustainer of what is manifest. And Shiva, which is the destruction, the dissolution, the return into the void, the outward breath, you could say. And so they did have a concept of the Trinity, although again, this could have been coming from just very operative perspective of like, well, everything in existence seems to come from somewhere, exist for a time, and disappear again back into somewhere. So that's something that's kind of observable, which they evolved their mythology and their belief and religion from that. But maybe the Irish had some concept of Trinity in this sense. We think of the Triskel, the very logo of the Brehon Academy. It's a Trinity, right? And there's many interpretations about what does this Triskel means. The truth is nobody really knows exactly what it means, but there's certainly an aspect of Trinity in this, and this carving is much older than Christianity. Is it too crazy then, looking at the Vedas for guidance as well, to imagine that maybe the early Irish had a concept of the Trinity, maybe in a different form than the Christian Trinity, but it was something that was familiar to them? Maybe the idea of having a soul that lasts forever, or at least can transmigrate into other forms, seems to be something that was held by the Irish. So the idea of having an eternal soul then, and heaven and hell, it's not a huge leap there. Okay, it's definitely a different belief, but this is what I think Macnamara is getting at when he says St. Patrick engrafted Christianity onto the pagan beliefs. It didn't challenge them. He found ways for them to fit and mold together. So we got a little bit of an insight into the Druids here, but the thing with the Druids, I find that the more you learn about them, the less you think you know, or you realize how little you know. They're very mysterious, and I have my own theories about what I think they were and what I think that they teach and what they believe, and I sort of liken them to being very early natural philosophers. What did the Druids study and what did they teach and believe? I think that the object of their work was truth, understanding truth, the nature and order of reality itself. Some of the topics that are associated with the Druids, if I can just unpack it a little bit, you have music, right, through the bardic order and the fili and the playing of the harp and the keeping of the histories. You have astronomy, the mapping of the stars as they move through the sky. You have geometry, the carvings, the architectural monuments, the standing stones, the geometry. And to me, these are very similar to the trivium and quadrivium method of classical education, where you had 7 subjects, the first 3 being grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the next 4 topics would be arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Because the belief with the liberal arts education is if you have studied in these 7 topics, you have the tools in your mind, your way of thinking and approaching information is such that you are completely free man. That's why they call it liberal education. You're a completely free man because you have the tools of comprehension, the tools of using your brain effectively. So why is this important? Because if you want to understand the truth and to have the tools to determine that what you believe is true, you need to have logic. You need to understand the grammar, the rules of grammar, and that's not just linguistic grammar, and rhetoric. First of all, that's comprehension. But then you need to go deeper. This is how do you apply the tools of comprehension, those three tools of comprehension, to reality itself? Well, the ancients knew, and the Druids knew, and the mystery schools know that reality is coded by numbers. It's a numerical reality, and that there are certain constants, mathematical truths that exist, whether or not man knows of them or not. They existed before we discovered them, and they exist whether we know of them or not. But that mathematics is essentially the language of reality itself. So in understanding the language of the number, you can begin to understand the mind of God. And why is that important? Because I'm tying together different motifs here, different thoughts about the Druids, and I'm trying to pull them together to see if we can get a clearer thought form from these different ideas. So I believe that they studied and worshipped truth, that they taught the tools, psychological tools, so individuals could determine and know the truth for themselves. And they sought, by having those tools, to understand the very nature of reality itself, the movement of the stars, harmonics in music, geometry, balance, counterbalance, all of these things, because those are the topics of truth, actually, of the truth of reality. Arithmetic is basically numbers, okay, basic arithmetic. Then you have geometry, which is numbers in space, okay, spatial, numbers in relation to spatial planes. And then you have music, which is numbers and time, okay, also packed in there is harmonics and so on. The music of the spheres, you know, the hum, the vibrational hum of existence itself, and how it can be captured through the plucking of a harp string. Yeah. And so you had numbers in space, numbers in time, and then astronomy, numbers in space and time. So I believe that that's fairly close to what the Druids actually taught and believe. I think that the Vedas connection is a strong one, and definitely if people are interested in these topics, doing a deep dive into the Vedas with the mind of an Irishman, you know, like using the Vedas as a sort of a lens for looking at our own history. I think there's a fascinating study there. And aside from all of that, something about this way of thinking about how did the early Irish think. I should say that these are not necessarily any of my own belief, but just it kind of makes sense to me. Like, it doesn't sound too crazy of an idea. It's not like too off the wall. It fits a lot of different kind of approaches to it, whether it's like anthropological, linguistic, historical, what little we do have about the Druids, but and their beliefs. But there's just something about this that kind of feels right. And then reading the works of Scottos, Regina, and Pelagius, some of what he said, you can see that this is not a new idea either. Like, this is something that they were grappling with back then, and that these sorts of ideas of that relate consciousness to religion, and religion to science, and science back to consciousness again. That the early Irish, when some people many centuries ago from Ireland were quite influential in thinking about these things, but also in articulating them and using their rhetoric, so that today in 2021 there's some random Irish guy making a video about their teachings. It's quite phenomenal. So that's enough of my rambling on this topic. I'd love to go into more information, but I think we're kind of running out of time for this video. There's a lot more we could go into here, and I'd love to hear any of your comments or ideas that came up as you were listening to this topic. Remember to hit like, subscribe if you like the video, and hit the notification bell if you want to see, when I upload a new video. If you want, I don't use notification bells, but apparently that's a thing you do. So if you want, you can get notified whenever I'm uploading a new video. Please check out the website, all that good stuff. If you want to reach out to me, you can do it at kev@brehonacademy.org. You can find me on Facebook. I've put a link to the website and the courses below. That's all from me. So until next time, Slán go fóill.